You know, there's a sense among many Australians that the great prosperous country that Australia was is fading away, and that in recent years our culture has changed for the worse. Big state ideology has taken hold and bureaucracy keeps expanding, immigration's exploded, marriage and families have dwindled, home ownership has become exponentially more difficult, and the cost of living continues to rise. The Australia that today's young people are growing up in is radically different to the seemingly carefree, prosperous nation of previous generations, like mine. I'm deeply sad about that. Many people I speak with feel that they've gone from being the lucky country to a dreary nanny state. Furthermore, the COVID experience lifted a veil and exposed a disturbing reality. While the perception of Australians in countries like the US and England has typically been that we're a bunch of friendly, relaxed people experiencing the grueling draconian lockdowns in 2020 and 2021 was shocking to people who had that perception. Wherever I spoke with Americans, they'd always ask me, what on earth is going on down there? And truthfully, it was hard to know what to tell them. But the cultural issues go further back than COVID. Mental illness seems more prominent than ever, and it's fair to assert that social media and smartphones have something to do with that as more kids grow up using them. Add to all of this is an education system that appears to value fighting climate change and producing social justice warriors over a more genuine and useful education. And it's fair to say that Australia's young people are facing unprecedented challenges. Many of them, sadly, seem cynical about the future, and one really can't blame them for that. However, these things aren't unique to Australia. They're happening across the Western world. The rise of what is commonly called populism can be explained by Westerners having a great sense of apprehension about where their nations are heading, something clearly that the COVID-19 pandemic and huge rates of immigration have exacerbated. People are searching for a sense of stability again as modern life feels increasingly unstable. They want to return to a time when people showed strength and exhibited the willingness to say what needs to be said without fear of triggering their fellow man. They want to return to a sense of national identity and patriotism in a time when the evils of colonialism are touted as the root of all evil by left-wing academics and think tanks. Europe's recent electoral swing to the right is evidence of this phenomenon. So too is the support for political figures like Nigel Farage and Donald Trump, who are simply willing to tell it like it is and seem to be channeling the patriotism of a time that people sense is slipping away. Now, I regularly speak with Aussie parents who share these thoughts and concerns, and naturally, one major area of concern for them is education. After all, their children spend 8 hours a day under the supervision of an education system that's presenting the government-approved curriculum. It's the curriculum working against parents and their children, trying to instill a worldview that is arguably destructive to them. Parents often tell me that schools should stick to the basics and focus on real education, but as former public school teacher from New York, John Taylor Gatto said, schools teach exactly what they are intended to teach, and they do it well. How to be a good Egyptian and remain in your place in the pyramid. Long gone, it seems, are the days when the education system was concerned with the contemplation of truth, the virtues of our Christian history, or practical wisdom. Today, many students spend their schooling hours learning about how to be greater advocates for supposedly oppressed minorities, learning about Indigenous history at the expense of apparently our racist colonial history and the fluidity of their gender and sexuality, not to mention, of course, the imminent climate apocalypse, which, unless something drastic is done within the next decade, will destroy life as we know it and render their schooling pointless anyway. It's really no wonder there's a youth mental health crisis. Some say this shift in education is just the result of the long march through the institutions. Communist sympathisers reached a point in various Western nations where they had to resort to what might be described as intention to subvert cultural institutions from within. As Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist, said, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity as the dominant cultural force. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Now, since the 60s, a lot of transforming of consciousness has taken place in Western nations, and much of that through education. In a now famous interview from 1984, the Soviet defector Yuri Bezmenov highlighted the importance of education via the subversive process he called demoralisation. He said, "It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralise a nation." Why that many? Because this is the minimum number of years it takes to educate one generation of students. Marxism, Leninism is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students. Now, if you can control what the students are being taught and the messages they're used to influence them more broadly, then they're easy to manage in adulthood. They can be disconnected from the past and something else steps in to fill the void. He was discussing his perspective of Soviet tactics during the Cold War, but the point is actually simple enough. Education is essential in transforming the consciousness of society, and that's why we need an education revolution in this country. While schools certainly have an important role to play, education begins in the home. And we've got to remember that it's primarily the duty of parents, not schools, to educate their children. Perhaps the fact that we're losing sight of that is itself evidence of the transformation of consciousness that's taken place in recent years. By every measure, it appears that a long march has taken place, whether orchestrated or organically, and the result is a weaker, more cynical, less prosperous Australia. The Long March is called that because it's been, well, long. The things I've described here, of course, are the result of decades of work, but we mustn't become depressed about it. There's always reason for hope. The fruit of so-called progressivism, which we might call wokeness, has become so inane and so absurd that people are increasingly becoming fed up with it. The narratives of radical sexual and gender grievances have become absolutely untenable, and the cost of living, as well as the passage of time, will ultimately knock this green energy agenda on its head. As culture inevitably recoils from this craziness, there will be a need for clear-headed, good-hearted people to step into the political space and get involved at local, state and federal levels. Politics, as they say, is downstream from culture. One thing that has amazed me about my time in politics is how many people get behind those who say the things they need to say, the things that the mainstream media and much of the political establishment, of course, are unwilling to say. And the recent Voice referendum provides a very clear example. If you believed much of the newspaper and the news media at the time, the implication was that it was clearly racist not to support the Voice. And one Labor MP even told me that asking how people would be expected to prove they were Indigenous to be in the Voice bureaucracy was itself borderline racist, even though I presume Indigenous people themselves would think that that was a pretty important question. This is exactly why people voted against the Voice. And of course, not to mention the stupidity of the idea to begin with, but those who promote so-called progressivism, wokeness or political correctness or whatever you want to call it, have now actually overplayed their hand, and it's the quiet Australians who are fighting back. Every state, except for the ACT, which is a territory, voted no. And what does that tell you? So be aware of the Long March and the changes that have taken place in Australia, but also understand that with patience and effort, we're going to turn things around so that Australians who are alive today and far in the future will enjoy what has made this country a great place to live in the first place. Not too long ago, for example, it seemed that nuclear energy wouldn't be considered anytime soon, and now we're having that discussion. Leftism, progressivism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, will lose in the end because we have reality on our side. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please consider sharing it with others. And as always, thank you for your support.